Greeting and warm welcome to you all to this brief presentation. My name is Pushpa Raj Paudel. I am a student of MPhil second semester at Nepal Open University. I would like to take this wonderful opportunity to express my sincere thanks to all my course facilitators of translation studies for their consistent encouragement to excel in this field. This presentation on formal and dynamic equivalence and semantic and communicative translation is part of my assignment of the course Seminar on Translation Studies. I am highly indebted to all the authors whose works I have consulted during the course of preparation of this presentation. The contents of this presentation include NIDA's concepts of formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence and the principle of equivalent effect, discussion of the importance of NIDA's work, Newmarks Semantic Translation and Communicative Translation, discussion of the importance of Newmarks Work, conclusion, references. The old terms such as literal, free, and faithful translation are discarded by NIDA in favor of two basic orientations or types of equivalence, formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. These are defined by NIDA as formal equivalence focuses attention on the message itself in both form and content. One is concerned that the message in the receptor language should match as closely as possible the different elements in the source language. Formal equivalence or formal correspondence is thus keenly oriented towards the source text structure, which exerts a strong influence in determining accuracy and correctness. Most typical of this kind of translation are gloss translations with a close approximation to source text structure, often with scholarly footnotes, allowing the students to gain close access to the language and customs of the source culture. Formal equivalence tries to remain as close to the original text as possible without adding the translator's ideas and thoughts into the translation. Thus, more literal the translation is, the less danger there is of corrupting the original message. This is therefore much more of a word-for-word view of translation. The problem with this form of translation is that it assumes a moderate degree of familiarity with the subject matter on the part of the reader. The King James Version and English Standard Version are two examples of this kind of translation. King James Version and English Standard Version are English translations from the Hebrew of the opening of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. Now, let me talk about dynamic equivalence. Dynamic or functional equivalence is based on what NIDA calls the principle of equivalent effect, where the relationship between receptor and message should be substantially the same as that which existed between the original receptors and the message. The message has to be tailored to the receptor's linguistic needs and cultural expectation and aims at complete naturalness of expression. Naturalness is a key requirement for NIDA. Indeed, he defined the goal of dynamic equivalence as seeking the closest natural equivalent to the source language message. This receptor-oriented approach considers adaptations of grammar, lexicon, and of cultural references to be essential in order to achieve naturalness. For NIDA, the success of translation depends above all on achieving equivalent response. It is one of the four basic requirements of a translation, which are making a sense, number one, number two, conveying the spirit and manner of the original, number three, having a natural and easy form of expression, and number four, producing a similar response. Although dynamic equivalence aims to meet all these requirements, it is also a graded concept, since NIDA accepts that the conflict between the traditional notions of content and form cannot always be easily resolved. As a general rule for such conflicts, NIDA underlines that correspondence in meaning must have priority over correspondence in style if equivalent effect is to be achieved. Now, let's discuss about the importance of NIDA's work. His introductions of the concepts of formal and dynamic equivalence were crucial in introducing a receptor-based orientation to translation theory. However, both the principle of equivalent effect and the concept of equivalence have come to be heavily criticized for a number of reasons. Van den Broek and Larousse consider equivalent effect or response to be impossible. Also, it was debatable whether a translator follows these procedures in practice. Edwin Gentler blames that the concept of dynamic equivalence serves the purpose of converting the receptors, no matter what their culture, to the dominant discourse and ideas of Protestant Christianity. Despite the heated debate it has provoked, NIDA's systematic linguistic approach to translation has been influential on many subsequent and prominent translation scholars. Among them, Peter Newmark is one. Now let's shed some light on Newmark's semantic and communicative translation. Newmark departs from NIDA's receptor-oriented line, feeling that the success of equivalent effect is illusory, and that the conflict of loyalties, the gap between emphasis on source and target language, will always remain as the overriding problem in translation theory and practice. Newmark suggests narrowing the gap by replacing the old terms with those of semantic and communicative translation. Communicative translation attempts to produce on its readers an effect as close as possible to that obtained on the readers of the original. Semantic translation attempts to render as closely as the semantic and syntactic structures of the second language allow the exact contextual meaning of the original. This description of communicative translation resembles NIDA's dynamic equivalence in the effect it is trying to create on the target text reader, while semantic translation has similarities to NIDA's formal equivalence. However, Newmark distances himself from the principle of equivalent effect, since that effect is inoperant if the text is out of target language space and time. For example, the modern British English translation of Homer, the translator, any modern translator cannot possibly hope or expect to produce the same effect on the target text reader as the source text had on listeners. In ancient Greece, Newmark indicates that semantic translation differs from literal translation in that it respects context, interprets, and even explains metaphors, etc. Comparison between Newmark's semantic and communicative translation in the next slide. So let's compare the semantic translation and communicative translation of Newmark, Peter Newmark. Semantic translation is source language oriented, whereas communicative translation is target language oriented. Semantic translation is written at the author's linguistic level, whereas communicative translation is written at the readership level. Similarly, semantic translation interprets, whereas communicative translation explains. Semantic translation to a greater extent is faithful to the source language text, whereas communicative translation is not so. Semantic translation is informative, whereas communicative translation is clearer, simpler, smoother, but a bit longer. So this way we can differentiate semantic translation and communicative translation. Now let's discuss on Newmark's work. Newmark's term semantic and communicative translation have often been quoted in the literature of translation theory, but they have generally received far less discussion than NIDA's formal and dynamic equivalence. Newmark considers communicative translation to be identical to NIDA's functional or dynamic equivalence. Newmark sometimes is criticized for his strong prescriptivism. However, the large number of examples in Newmark's work provide ample guidance and advice for the trainee translators, and many of the questions he tackles are of important practical relevance to translation. Now let's discuss about the conclusion of this presentation. Yes, NIDA and Newmark are two outstanding Western theorists in the field of translation. both of them have rich experience in translation and they have written many articles and theoretical works on translation. NIDA's approach in translation are formal and dynamic equivalence. Formal equivalence focuses attention on the message itself in both form and content. However, dynamic equivalence is seeking the closest natural equivalence to the source language message. Newmarks semantic and communicative translations like NIDA's are great contribution to the translation study in the world. Semantic translation attempts to render as closely as the semantic and syntactic structures of the second language allow the exact contextual meaning of the original. However, communicative translation attempts to produce on its readers an effect as close as possible to that obtained on the readers of the original. So we have come to almost at the end of the presentation. These are some of the sources that I consulted during the course of the preparation of this presentation. Similarly, next slide. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening so actively and patiently. Thank you very much.